The wind had a way of telling stories in the old American villages, stories that slipped through the cracks of wooden porches, whistled past worn fences, and lingered in the hush of lantern-lit nights. Out in the distance, where the prairie grass swayed like a restless sea, the mountains stood watch, quiet and eternal. That was where he came from. The Apache who never said much, who often carried silence heavier than the rifle across his back. Folks in the village whispered about him when he walked by, though he never gave them reason to fear. He had the look of a man who had walked through storms and carried the dust of long-forgotten roads in his eyes. But that evening, under the orange fading sky, he was not out hunting or scouting trails. He lay still on the wooden bench just outside the small trading post, head tilted, eyes half closed as though sleep had caught him. Yet he was wide awake. The Apache was pretending, watching, waiting. He had noticed the shy girl before, always quiet, always slipping around like she didn't want anyone to notice her. She worked at the general store, her hands quick with the cloth sacks, her gaze always cast low, as though the world was too much for her. She never laughed too loud, never stepped too close, and never seemed to belong to the noisy chatter of the others. The Apache had a reason for pretending that day. He wanted to see who she really was when no one else was watching. In the village, people wore masks, some of pride, some of fear, some of loneliness. But a person's true self often came alive when they thought the world had its eyes turned away. He wanted to know if she was just timid, or if there was something hidden beneath the layers of her silence. The porch creaked softly when she stepped out, arms full of folded linens from the store. Her steps were small, careful, as though she was afraid the earth itself might protest if she made too much noise. She paused when she saw him stretched out there, eyes closed, breathing steady like a man deep in slumber. For a long moment she stood frozen, the light from the doorway framing her in soft gold. The Apache could feel her eyes on him, though he never stirred. His heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from a strange tension he hadn't felt in years. The girl glanced around quickly, making sure no one else was near. The street was empty, the last wagon having rattled off minutes ago. The horses tied near the trough had already grown still. She shifted the linens to one arm, then hesitant. At first stepped closer to him. Her shadow fell across his chest, and he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap clinging to her clothes. The Apache listened carefully, every sense sharpened. He expected her to walk past him, maybe even hurry away, as she always did. Instead, she lingered. He heard the soft hitch in her breath, the small, nervous sound of someone wrestling with a thought. Then, in the hush of the fading dusk, she did something that made his heart jolt. She bent down slowly, her hand trembling just slightly, and reached toward him, not in fear, not in suspicion, but with a strange tenderness, like she was checking if he was really there. Her fingertips brushed lightly against his sleeve, as if she wanted to feel the fabric, to prove to herself that he was more than a figure of silence and rumor. He stayed still, his mind racing, his blood thrumming in his ears. It wasn't the touch alone that startled him. When she thought his eyes were shut at him, when she thought his eyes were shut, not with fear, not with caution, but with something softer, something that carried questions she would never speak aloud. Her gaze lingered on his face, searching, almost aching, as though she wanted to understand the story. Behind the man everyone else kept at a distance. The Apache felt something inside him twist. He had faced storms, hunger, and the sharp edge of war without flinching, but the quiet honesty in her eyes nearly made him shift from his act. Still, he remained frozen in his role, though every nerve screamed at him to open his eyes, to ask her what she saw in him that even he could not name. The girl, unaware of his racing thoughts, let her hand rest just a second longer before pulling back quickly, as if ashamed of her own courage. She straightened, hugged the linens tighter to her chest, and cast one last look at him. The Apache waited for her to turn and leave, but she didn't, at least not right away. She lingered there in the twilight, lips pressed together, her breath catching as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then, so faintly he wondered if he imagined it, she whispered something into the cooling night air. The words were soft, almost broken, but they carried a weight that rooted him deeper to the bench. He could not move, could not breathe for a moment. And the weight of his choice pressed heavy upon him, whether to keep pretending or to open his eyes and let her know he had heard every word. The sky had deepened to indigo, and the first stars trembled above the rooftops. The air grew still, holding on to the moment like the village itself was waiting for what would happen next. The Apache felt the tension in his chest rise, a tension unlike any battle he had ever known. He had set out to test her, to understand her, but now it was his own spirit caught in the test. Her footsteps finally retreated across the porch, soft and hesitant, leaving him alone once more. Yet the echo of her touch, the whisper of her voice, and the unspoken truth in her eyes clung to him like the scent of rain before a storm. He had thought himself untouchable, a man carved from silence and stone. But in that fragile moment, the shy girl had unsettled him more than anything else ever could. And as he finally opened his eyes to the empty street, his breath caught in his throat, or what she had whispered was still ringing in his ears, and he knew it would not let him rest. Or the test he thought he had set for her had become a question for himself. And the answer would change more than just one quiet night. In the old American village, the Apache sat frozen, staring into the dark, knowing he could no longer pretend not to her, and not to himself. But he also knew that whatever he chose, the shy girl had already seen something in him no one else had ever dared to see, and the night was only just beginning. The Apache did not move for a long while after the girl disappeared into the dimly lit store. The wooden porch felt rough beneath him, the air cooling fast as the night swept down from the hills. He tried to slow his breathing, but the words she had whispered refused to let him be. They stirred something inside him he had long believed buried. He had heard confessions before pleas of mercy on battlefields, whispered prayers over dying men, but this had been different. This had not been for him to hear, and yet he had. That small, trembling voice had been filled with something that caught his chest like a snare. He leaned forward and rubbed his hands over his face, the calloused palms rough against his skin. He had meant to test her, nothing more. In the village, people judged quickly. They saw his quiet ways and painted their own stories over him. Some called him dangerous, others called him proud, but few dared to speak to him long enough to know. He had grown used to the distance. He had accepted it. But the girl had looked at him with eyes that carried no fear, only a question he did not yet understand. The lamps in the windows glowed faintly as the village settled into the rhythm of night. Dogs barked once or twice in the distance, then grew quiet. A horse stamped its hoof against the dirt, chains rattling softly. From somewhere, laughter drifted faintly, the kind of laughter that belonged to those who felt safe in their place. Apache had always stood just outside such circles. He had made peace with it long ago. Yet tonight, he could not shake the thought that maybe he did not want that peace anymore. He rose from the bench and walked slowly down the dirt street, his boots sinking into the dust. The houses were small, built from worn timber, their porches leaning a little from years of weather. Curtains fluttered in the open windows, letting out thin stripes of lamplight across the road. The Apache had seen many villages like this, places where life moved slow, where gossip traveled faster than wagons, and where every secret was only a half-open door away from being known. But there was something about this village that felt different. Perhaps it was the way the shy girl carried herself, as though she bore a secret larger than the narrow street could hold. He thought of her again, the way she had dared to reach for him, the way her voice had faltered, but still found the courage to speak. It was not the act of someone who was only shy. That was the act of someone fighting something within, a silence deeper than her soft words could cover. The Apache understood silence. He had lived inside it for years, and maybe that was why her quiet strength unsettled him more than shouts or threats ever could. The next morning, the village woke slowly. The sun climbed over the ridges, painting the rooftops in pale gold. Smoke rose from chimneys, wagons rattled into the square, and children ran barefoot through the dust. The Apache was already awake, though sleep had not come easy. He stood near the edge of the well, filling a tin cup with water, when he saw her again. She was carrying a basket of bread from the bakery, her steps careful as always, her eyes downcast. She passed close by, and for the briefest moment, her gaze lifted. Their eyes met, just long enough for the memory of last night to pass between them like a shadow. Her cheeks flushed. She quickened her pace, disappearing around the corner. The Apache stood still, the water forgotten in his hand. He wondered if she knew he had been awake, if she guessed he had heard her, and if she did, why had she not avoided him completely? Through the day he watched the rhythm of the village. Men gathered near the smithy, talking of wagons and tools. Women bartered at the store, voices weaving together in chatter and laughter. Children darted between buildings, their shouts carrying across the open space. But beneath it all, he noticed how the shy girl moved differently. She never lingered long in crowds. She avoided loud voices, slipping quietly around corners like a shadow. Yet, when she thought no one noticed, her eyes wandered to places beyond the village. Out toward the hills and the horizon, as if she longed for something the village could not give. That night, the Apache returned to the bench outside the trading post. The stars hung low and bright, the kind of stars that seemed close enough to touch. He leaned back against the wall, his hat tilted low, and waited. The village grew quiet again, lanterns dimming one by one. He was not sure if she would come, or if she would stay behind her closed door. But he had learned patience from the land itself, and he would wait. At last the store door opened, spilling a faint strip of light across the porch. She stepped out, arms empty this time, her hair pulled back loosely. She froze when she saw him, but only for a second. Then gathering herself, she walked past him without a word. He did not move, did not speak, though every part of him wanted to. Her steps slowed as she reached the end of the porch, and for a moment it seemed she might stop. But instead she kept walking, her figure slipping into the shadows of the street. Apache sat there long after she was gone, listening to the stillness. He thought of the way she had whispered to him, of the touch that still burned faintly on his sleeve. He thought of the look in her eyes, a look that carried both fear and longing. And he knew this was no simple story of a shy girl and a silent man. Something deeper was stirring, something that would not be quieted by pretending to sleep or by walking away. The days passed, each one feeding the question that hung between them. The Apache continued his quiet watch, pretending to blend into the village while his thoughts circled endlessly around her. And she, though she never spoke to him, seemed unable to keep her distance. Their paths crossed in small ways her hand, brushing his as she passed him a bundle of flour at the store, her eyes flicking toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. The tension grew, silent but undeniable. Weaving through the dust in the quiet streets like an invisible thread, the Apache knew danger when he saw it. He had spent his life reading signs, the trail of an enemy, the bend of grass in the wind, the unease in a man's eyes before he drew a weapon. And though no rifle or knife was drawn here, he felt the same danger building. Only this time, it was not a threat to his life, but to the walls he had built around his heart, and still, he could not pull back. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, he found himself walking toward the edge of the village. The air smelled of dust and sage, the sky bleeding red and gold. He did not know why his steps carried him there, only that something urged him forward. As he rounded the bend, near the old wooden fence, he stopped. She was there, sitting alone on the grass, her basket set aside, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She did not hear him at first. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, the wind tugging gently at her hair. There was a sadness in her posture, something that spoke louder than words. He stood frozen, torn between turning away and stepping closer. And in that pause she sighed softly, as if speaking to herself. The Apache felt the weight of the moment press down on him. This was not chance. This was not a simple crossing of paths. Whatever her secret was, whatever had made her whisper to him in the night, it was beginning to reveal itself. And he knew, without question, that stepping closer would change everything. But he also knew he could no longer turn back. The Apache stayed where he was, half hidden by the fence in the shadow of the oak tree, his chest rising with a slow, measured breath. The shy girl sat not 20 paces away, her figure caught in the last glow of sunset, the wind teasing strands of hair loose around her face. She looked small against the wide horizon, but there was something in her stillness that made her seem larger than the village itself, like she belonged to some deeper truth beyond the dirt streets and worn-out houses. He watched as she clasped her hands tight, her lips moving in words too faint for him to hear. He thought of stepping closer, of breaking his silence, but the weight of the moment held him back. She had secrets. He knew it. The village might see her as shy, plain, forgettable. But there was a storm beneath that quiet. He had felt it in the way she touched his sleeve, in the whisper that still haunted his nights. He was not the kind of man to chase after mysteries. Life had taught him to survive, to endure, to walk away before trouble could root itself in his chest. Yet here he stood, unable to move, drawn to the very thing he should avoid. The girl turned her head suddenly, her eyes scanning the field behind her as though she sensed something watching. The Apache pressed against the fence post, his body still as stone, though his pulse quickened. She lingered, searching the twilight shadows, then turned back to the horizon with a sigh. He realized she was not looking for him. She was looking for something else, or perhaps someone. A crow flew overhead, its harsh cry breaking the silence. She startled, clutching her basket close, then rose to her feet. Her steps carried her quickly back toward the village. The Apache followed her with his gaze until the dim light swallowed her figure. Only then did he step out from the shadows. He walked slowly across the grass where she had sat, the earth still warm from the day's sun. He knelt, brushing his hand over the bent blades, and thought of the sadness in her posture. It was the kind of sadness that did not come from loneliness alone. It was the sadness of a person carrying something too heavy to speak aloud. The Apache straightened and walked back toward the village, his mind restless. That night, sleep refused him again. He lay in the small cabin at the edge of the settlement, staring at the beams overhead while the fire burned low. Memories pressed in the long trails he had ridden, the battles fought, the people he had lost. He had known grief and silence, had built his life upon them. And yet the quiet sorrow in her eyes stirred something in him that even memory could not match. He was beginning to fear that the conflict growing between them was not only about who she was, but who he himself had become. Days passed, and the village moved in its usual rhythm, but underneath it all, the Apache sensed change. He noticed the way people watched him more closely now, as if they too sensed a shift. He noticed the way the girl avoided him with greater care during the day, only for her eyes to betray her whenever they crossed paths. It was as if both of them carried a secret tether, pulling them together even as they tried to step apart. One afternoon, while he worked near the stables, sharpening a blade, he overheard two villagers speaking. Their voices were low, but the words carried across the quiet yard. They spoke of the girl. They spoke of her family, how little anyone really knew about them, how her mother had died too young, how her father had vanished one night without explanation. Some said he had abandoned her. Others whispered he had fallen into trouble with men from outside the village. The Apache kept his eyes on the blade, but his ears sharpened. The girl's silence suddenly seemed less like shyness and more like protection of something the rest of the village was too blind to see. Later, when evening fell and lanterns flickered along the porches, he walked past the general store. The girl was inside, bent over the counter, arranging goods. She looked up, and for a fleeting instant, their eyes locked through the window. Her face paled, and she turned away quickly, pretending to be busy. But the Apache had caught it, the flash of fear, the flicker of guilt. It was as if she knew he was piecing her secret together, and it frightened her more than the whispers of the townsfolk ever could. That night, the Apache returned to his bench outside the trading post. He sat with his arms folded, staring out. At the quiet street, he thought about her father. He thought about the way she always looked toward the horizon, as if expecting someone to come. He thought about her whisper, the one he had heard when she believed he was asleep. Perhaps she had been speaking to him, or perhaps she had been speaking to someone who was no longer there. Either way, it left him tangled in questions he could not ignore. The conflict grew sharper inside him. He had come to this village to disappear, to live quietly and without ties. Yet now, his every thought bent toward her. Was he being drawn into something that would break the fragile peace he had found? Or was this the very thing fate had kept him wandering for? As if to deepen the storm, a new tension began to ripple through the village. Strangers had been spotted on the outskirts, men on horseback, unfamiliar, their presence stirring unease. Some said they were traders, others said drifters, but the Apache knew better. He had lived long enough to read the signs. Strangers rarely came without reason. And when they came in groups, reason often turned to trouble. One evening, just as the last light was leaving the sky, he saw the girl again, near the well. She was drawing water, her hands moving quick, her eyes darting nervously. She nearly dropped the bucket at the sight of him standing there. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but no words came. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them. Then, with a small shake of her head, she walked past him, her pace hurried. The Apache stood rooted, could feel it now, the connection between her secrets and the strangers near the hills. The threads were tightening, pulling him deeper, whether he wished it or not. He looked out into the fading twilight, his jaw set. Something was coming. He could feel it as surely as he could feel the ground beneath his boots. And yet the greatest danger was not outside the village, it was within. It was in the girl's silence, in the truth she carried like a stone pressed to her chest. It was in his own heart, which had begun to care too deeply for a secret he was not meant to hold. As the night deepened, the Apache sat once more on the porch, staring at the stars. His mind was caught between two battles. The one he sensed was creeping toward the village, and the one unraveling within himself. Both would demand something of him. Both would come sooner than he was ready for. And somewhere in the quiet darkness, he knew the shy girl was awake too, fighting her own battles, whispering words into the night that only the wind could hear. The tension hung heavy, unbroken, and the Apache realized that whatever truth lay between them, it was not one that could remain hidden much longer. The days that followed were restless ones. The Apache felt the shift in the air, the way a hunter senses danger before the prey ever stirs. The strangers had not yet entered the village, but their presence clung to the edges of the land like a storm waiting to break. Men on horseback left faint tracks along the ridges, and sometimes in the distance, the glint of steel caught the sunlight. The villagers muttered nervously about drifters and outlaws, but none dared to act. They told themselves it was nothing. Yet each night doors were bolted earlier, lanterns burned longer, voices hushed when shadows passed by the windows. The Apache kept to his quiet watch, his eyes sharper now than ever. He saw the unease in the people, but he also saw something more troubling in the shy girl. She moved quickly through her tasks, her shoulders hunched, her face pale with worry. Her silence grew heavier, like a rope pulled too tight, and though she tried to hide it, he noticed how often her gaze flicked toward the hills, as though she expected those strangers to walk straight into her life. He told himself to keep his distance, to let the village manage its own troubles. But every time he saw her clutch her basket a little too tight or stumble in her steps, when someone mentioned the word drifters, the wall inside him cracked further. He had meant to test her that first night, to peel back the mask of shyness, but he had never expected to find himself caught in her storm. Now it was no longer about curiosity. It was about something deeper, something that pulled at him with the force of an unseen tide. One evening, as the sun bled red over the ridge, he caught sight of her near the church steps. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her lips moving. In prayer, though no sound carried, he stood at the edge of the square watching as the light dimmed around her. When she rose and turned, she saw him. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, she did not look away. Her gaze held his, steady but filled with sorrow, and then she walked past him into the fading light.
Oh, that look was enough to tell him that.
Truth. She knew those strangers were not random. Whatever tied them to her would soon reach the heart of the village. The Apache spent that night pacing the floor of his small cabin. He thought of leaving, saddling his horse, and disappearing into the wilderness where no one could follow. It would have been the easy path, the safe path, But he knew the truth. He would not leave. Something bound him here now, a thread woven, tight between his silence and her secrets. If danger came for her, he could not stand aside. The following day brought proof that the storm was closer than anyone wanted to admit. A wagon rolled into the square, its wheels creaking under the weight of supplies. On the back of it rode two men, strangers to the village. They were rough-faced, eyes sharp with the kind of watchfulness that comes from living on the wrong side of the law. They asked no questions, bought no goods, and left as quickly as they came. But the way their eyes lingered on the buildings, the people, and especially the girl as she stepped from the store, it told the Apache everything he needed to know. They were marking the place, measuring it, and they were looking for her. That night, the Apache took his post outside the trading post once more, sat still, his body relaxed, but his mind burning with restless thought. The moon rose high, bathing the village in silver light. Hours passed in silence, until at last he heard the soft creak of the store door. The shy girl stepped out, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes heavy with worry. She did not notice him at first, but when her gaze fell upon him, she froze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a trembling breath, she walked closer. Her hands clutched the fabric of her dress, and her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "They're here." The Apache did not move. He let the words settle between them like stones dropped into deep water. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. Her eyes flickered wide and frightened. "The men, the ones I thought I left behind. They've found me." She glanced over her shoulder, as if the shadows themselves might lunge at her. "They'll come for me, and they won't stop." He studied her face, the way fear had etched itself into every line. It was not the fear of someone imagining ghosts. It was the fear of someone who knew the danger firsthand. "Why?" he asked. She shook her head, tears glinting in the moonlight. "I can't tell. Not yet. If I do, it'll put you in danger too." The Apache felt the pull of conflict tighten in his chest. He could walk away, let her carry her secrets alone. That had always been his way. But as he looked at her trembling hands, he knew he could not. Silence had been his weapon, his shield, but for the first time, it was not enough. The girl turned. Suddenly, her steps hurried as she fled back toward her home. He let her go, though every part of him wanted to follow. He sat in the silence, long after she vanished, the weight of her words pressing into him like the cold night air. The next days moved slower, heavier. The strangers lingered near the outskirts, their presence now impossible to ignore. The villagers grew restless, and whispers turned into fear. Children were called inside earlier, and men polished rifles that had long gathered dust. The Apache moved through it all like a shadow, saying nothing, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched the girl carefully. She worked as always, but her steps were hurried, her shoulders tense. At times, she would vanish for an hour or more, slipping into the fields beyond the village, only to return pale and weary. Each time he wanted to follow her, to demand the truth, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, like she wanted to trust him, but fear bound her tighter than any rope. Then came the night when the air itself seemed to crack with tension. The moon was hidden behind clouds, the village wrapped in uneasy darkness. The Apache stood at the edge of the square, his instincts sharper than ever. He felt it before it came, the prickle along his spine, the whisper of danger on the wind, and then he heard it. The faint rhythm of hooves, the low murmur of voices moving closer. The strangers had come back. The Apache melted into the shadows, his eyes fixed on the dark figures slipping between the buildings. They moved with purpose, quiet but not cautious enough to fool him. They were looking for her. Every step they took, every whisper they shared, tightened the noose around the village. He felt the weight of his decision press down hard. He had tried to keep apart, to remain only a watcher. But the storm had broken, and there was no longer room for silence. The girl's secret was tied to these men, and whatever truth she carried, it was about to crash down on all of them. In the distance, he saw her door crack open, a faint line of light spilling into the night. She stepped out slowly, her face pale as chalk as though she too had felt the shift in the air. She clutched something close to her chest, something wrapped in cloth. Her eyes swept the street, and then she froze, her gaze falling on the shadows moving toward her. The Apache tensed, his muscles coiled like a drawn bow. The moment had come, the threads pulled tight to the breaking point. He could feel it in the air, in the silence, in the pounding of his own heart. The girl's secret, the stranger's pursuit. The village's fear it had all led to this, and in that breathless pause before the storm broke, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The Apache did not wait for the strangers to make their move. As the girl froze on her porch with the bundle in her arms, he stepped out of the shadows, his boots striking the dirt with steady purpose. The men turned at once, their hands twitching near their belts, their eyes narrowing as they measured. "Him!" The girl gasped softly, her knuckles white around the cloth she clutched. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of a horse shifting somewhere in the distance. "You don't belong here," the Apache said, his voice low, but edged with steel. The taller of the two strangers smirked. "Neither do you." His gaze slid to the girl, then back to the Apache. "We've come for what's ours. Step aside." The Apache did not move. He had seen this kind of man before, hungry, ruthless, feeding on fear. The presence explained everything. The girl's secret glances toward the horizon, her whispered words, her trembling silence. These were the ghosts she had been hiding from. And now they had come to drag her into the open. "She doesn't belong to you," the Apache said. The second man spat into the dirt. "She belongs to debts that were never paid." The girl's voice finally broke through, shaky, but strong enough to carry. "No, I don't." Her arms tightened around the cloth, and with trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside was a small box, worn and scratched, the wood chipped from years of travel. She held it out, her voice breaking. "This is what you want. Take it and leave." The men stiffened, their eyes locking onto the box. The Apache glanced at it, but his focus remained on their hands. He saw the greed burning in their faces, saw the way they leaned forward, like wolves ready to strike. The girl's secret was not about herself. It was about whatever lay inside that box. But the Apache also saw the truth. Giving it up would not end this. Men like these never left clean. Before either stranger could take another step, the Apache shifted forward, placing himself between them and the girl. His presence was enough to halt them for a moment. The taller man's grin slipped, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake. I've made worse," the Apache replied. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, but his voice was calm. "This ends tonight. Leave her be." Standoff stretched long, the night pressing in on all sides. Then, as if sensing the change, the girl stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the strangers. "You'll never stop chasing me if I keep running," she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "But I'm not running anymore." The Apache turned slightly, just enough to catch the look in her eyes. It was not fear alone that held her, it was the choice to face what had haunted her. For the first time, he understood the strength beneath her quiet, the courage hidden behind her silence. The strangers exchanged a glance, muttered something too low to catch, and then the taller one stepped back. "Not worth it," he spat. "Not with him standing in the way?" He shot a glare at the Apache, then at the girl. "You keep it. But don't think this is over." With that, he turned, his partner following, their boots crunching in the dirt until the darkness swallowed them. The girl sagged with relief, the tension draining from her shoulders. The Apache stayed still, his eyes fixed on the path the men had taken, waiting until the night grew quiet again. Only then did he turn to her. "What's in the box?" Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a bundle of papers, old and yellowed, tied together with string. She held them out, her eyes lowered. "My father's deeds. Land. Promises he made. They've hunted me for years, thinking I'm the key to riches he left behind. But I never cared for it. I only wanted peace." The Apache looked down at the worn papers, then at her face. The weight she carried made sense, now the whispers in the night. The constant glances over her shoulder, the sadness that followed her like a shadow. She had been carrying not just grief but danger passed down from a man long gone. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said softly. Her eyes lifted, shining with tears. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." He thought of all the nights he had sat in silence, watching her from the porch, pretending not to care. He thought of her trembling hand brushing his sleeve, of her whispered confession. In the dark. And he realized that in his own way, he had known her longer than he cared to admit. "Because I do," he said simply. The words settled between them, quiet but heavy. For a long while, neither moved. The village lay silent around them, the night deep and still, as if holding its breath. Then the girl closed the box, clutching it tight once more. "What do I do now?" The Apache glanced toward the horizon where the strangers had vanished. "You live," he said, "not in fear, not in silence. Live." The days that followed, the strangers did not return. Whether they had truly given up or were biding their time, no one could say. But the village began to breathe again. Doors stayed open longer. Laughter returned to the square, and the heavy silence that had lingered around the girl began to lift. She still carried the box, but now she carried it openly, no longer hiding it in the dark. The villagers whispered at first, then grew quiet as they realized the truth that the shy girl had overlooked for so long had faced something greater than any of them had known. The Apache remained at the edge of it all, full as ever. Yet something inside him had shifted. The walls he had built around himself, the silence he had worn like armor, no longer held the same power. He found himself speaking more, though never much, and when his path crossed hers, there was no longer the same distance between them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, she walked toward him in the square. The box was not in her hands this time. Instead, she carried only a small loaf of bread from the bakery. She stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that had not been there before. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, his gaze steady. "You found your voice." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you helped me find it?" They stood there in the quiet, the sounds of the village around them, children laughing, wagon creaking, the hum of voices drifting through open doors. It was ordinary, simple, human. Yet within it, something unspoken passed between them. Something that did not need words. The Apache looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the past ease. He had not expected to find anything in this village. Least of all, someone who could reach into his silence and draw him back into the world. She had. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, he no longer felt the pull to walk it alone. As the night settled once more, the stars rose high and bright. The girl sat on the porch of the store, and the Apache took his place on the bench outside, the trading post. Their eyes met across the square, and for the first time, there was no fear. No distance, only quiet understanding. The story of the shy girl and the silent Apache had been one of secrets, silence, and shadows. But in the end, it became something else, a story of courage, of facing ghosts, of choosing to stand rather than run. And in that choice, both of them found something worth keeping. The village carried on, life flowing in its slow, familiar rhythm. Yet beneath it all, there was the quiet truth of what had happened to souls who had crossed paths in silence and found, in each other, the strength to finally speak.